Good morning, everyone. Sorry we're a few minutes late. Sometimes the gods don't smile on us. But fortunately, we are brave in the face of opposition. I should say they rather than I, but here we are again. So, good morning, everyone. It's Monday. And so on Mondays, I remind you that this ministry exists because of your generosity, which has been truly impressive. But those of you who feel inspiration from what we're doing here and wish to support it, you can support through Patreon, which is a marvelous site for supporting creative people in their creative efforts, or directly by going to my website, Asha Joy. So I want to thank you for that in advance, and also to remind you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribing seems to be a good idea, and I will try to find out why. But in the meantime, just take my word for it. Somehow we get privileges or something like that. So thank you. Let's start now with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence that we may act in accordance with your vibration and your guidance. We are your children. We seek only to live in harmony with your will. Show us the way. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, my friends, we finished up Money Magnetism last week with a wonderful, here I go again, putting very positive adjectives on my own work, wonderful discussion of what crystal clarity means. Swami's 4-paragraph description about the importance of crystal clarity in all that we do. I call it wonderful because I felt a tremendous amount of inspiration, and I also learned a lot. So for that reason, I think that whole series was just marvelous. There's a lot of things I have needed to learn about money, and I felt a lot of them were coming clearer for me over the course of having to explain it. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity these broadcasts have provided me. So I always know that something else is coming, and last night I figured out what it was, or Saturday I did. This is a book that Swami wrote, Paramhansa Yogananda, a biography, with personal reflections and reminiscences. Swami wrote this book quite late in his life. Let me just see what the date is. It was copyright 2011, and he passed in 2013. And he sort of ruefully remarked that it had never occurred to him to write a biography of Master until just the thought all of a sudden came to him. And he wrote it very quickly in a matter of weeks. And it doesn't strive to be comprehensive, like the book Phil Goldberg wrote, for example, tells you where Master was every day, practically. But it's more the essence of who Yogananda was, telling stories and just giving a summary of his life. It's a wonderful book and extraordinarily deep. Swami just felt it channeling through him. So I'm not going to do the whole book. But there is a chapter, it's chapter 17 in the book, and it's called Yogananda's Salient Characteristics. And I believe there's 32 here, if I'm not wrong. Let's see. Yeah, 32. And so each one of them, of course, not only describes what it was like to be with Master, but it also describes for us what it is to be a Master. And in other words, what it is that we have to emulate. Excuse me a moment. I think I'm going to sneeze. It's spring. How can you tell? Because you can hear Asha sneezing at all times of the day or night. So, what the characteristics that we ourselves have to adopt in order to have the consciousness of a master. So I found this chapter, which I've reviewed and actually even gave a class on it many years ago when the book came out, on the same chapter. It's very deep and wonderful to think about it. It also helps us understand what a master was really like. I was starting to say, and what master was really like. Because over time, people are selective in their memories. And to impersonalize it in this sense, he illustrates them with stories sometimes, but it still just gives us a much clearer idea. So let's dive in. And we're going to be with this, you can imagine, with 32 characteristics. We're going to be at it for a while. So number 1, the outstanding trait I observed was Master's complete absence of ego. When I looked into his eyes, it was like looking into infinity. One time, Devi Mukherjee, a disciple from Calcutta, said something to Master about his humility. The Guru replied, "How can there be humility when there is no consciousness of ego?" Swami goes on to say, a perfect example of his freedom from ego is a story I'll tell in the next chapter about a certain judge. And I'm going to read that also. My point here is that the Master could accept any insult and never be affected by it. As you'll see, he accepted that judge's withering contempt with goodwill. I never saw him affected to even the slightest degree by anything that anyone ever said about him. I mean, that's really quite a comment just by itself. I never saw him affected even to the slightest degree by anything anyone ever said to him. I'm going to just use my glasses. It's easier here. She says it's easier and she can't even get her glasses on. It's not a very, very outstanding morning so far. Let's keep working on it. Okay, we start late. She can't get her glasses on. Maybe things will improve as the day progresses. And here we are. We can find page 138. We've got that down. So, during Paramhansa Yogananda's return to India, because that's what this chapter is about that, he managed to get his school in Ranchi on a sound financial footing. I think that was mostly due to Rajasi. At the time, a large function was held, actually, pretty sure that's true. At the time, a large function was held to commemorate the accomplishments to date of this Brahmacharya Vidyalaya, as he called the school. Brahmacharya means control of one's own energy. It doesn't just mean being a celibate monk. It just means being able to control your energy. Vidyalaya means, I think, a school for life. I think this is where the phrase education for life came from. Whom shall we get to preside at this event? The Master asked. It's the custom in India to have some prominent person be your guest of honor at events. When Swami had book launches in India, they would always invite some prominent individuals to come and sort of like endorse the event. It was just the custom in India. There was general agreement. The best possible person would be a judge in that district, one Guru Das Banerjee. Yogananda went there to extend an invitation. He was not at all prepared, however, for the reception he received. The judge, on hearing this Swami's request, launched into a tirade against all the Swamis in India. India is overburdened with these worthless fellows, cried the judge, of whom I see a prime example before me. I have no time to waste on their useless functions. Why on earth should I attend such an absurd event? He went on for some time in this vein, leaving Yogananda well assured that the visit had been fruitless. Calmly and politely, the Master replied, "Thank you for your answer. Nevertheless, we shall be honored to have you preside at our event, should you care to grace us with your presence." He left and then devoted himself to finding a substitute. Everyone agreed at last on the principle of a local school. The event began. The principal initiated it, then asked the first speaker to address the large crowd. This man had hardly begun his speech when a car drove up. Judge Banerjee stepped out. way was made for him as he walked up to the lecture platform. The school principal gladly turned the meeting over to him. Banerjee sat and listened while the report was concluded. Many graduates of this school, the speaker announced, have gone on to become swamis. Our school's glory is spreading throughout the land. He finally sat down, and Judge Banerjee rose to his feet. This day, the judge announced, is one of the happiest days of my life. When your Swami Yogananda came and invited me to preside at this function, I felt a thrill of joy go through me. I decided I must test this man to see if he really is as good as he seems. I said everything I could think of to insult him and the principles he represents. And I have to tell you, he passed my test better than I would have thought possible. I have something else to tell you. Never mind about the swamis that are being produced by this school. India has many swamis. But if you can produce even one man as great as this one, not only your school, but all of India will be glorified. Well, that was quite a fun story, isn't it? You know, just the way that the judge responded and the way Master responded. So the line here that I think is so touching, there's two lines here. How can there be humility when there is no sense of ego? And the second, I never saw Master affected to even the slightest degree by anything that anyone ever said about him. So this is sort of beginning to help us understand what the difference is between a master and us. I don't think we want it to depress us in any way, but it also gives us a much clearer idea of how do we go forward. I'm going to start with how can there be humility when there is no sense of ego? And this is what Master is showing us, which is something that I saw many times in the life of Swamiji and have heard about in the life of Master, but because I didn't know him, of course, I wouldn't know directly. That very often I thought that Swamiji was having a good attitude, or that he was very disciplined, or that he could keep his focus, or various things like that, because I could often have a good attitude. And I could often keep my focus, and I could often say, I know how I'm supposed to behave. I have an inclination to behave a different way, but I don't have to give in to that inclination. I can hold steady to my principles. And I'm not talking about suppression. I'm talking about genuinely being close enough to victory that I can hold the line. It's a bit, if you want to think in terms of physical terms or just projects that you have to do, you can be at the point where you have reluctance to do something, you don't want to do it. I'm just thinking about projects that I work on, but I know if I just sit down and start, I will be able to do it, and by the end I'll be really happy that I did. So I'm not suppressing anything, I'm just disciplining myself and redirecting my energy into the way I want it to go. And when I do the right thing, there's a tremendous satisfaction that comes that gives me the energy to do it the next time. And that's the progress of sadhana and of spiritual life. I recognize my reluctance. I don't pretend that I don't have reluctance, but I can master it. Now, but there's still always that little struggle on the field of Kurukshetra, where you have to push yourself in one direction and have the victory. So with Master, when he talks about there's no sense of the proper place for the ego, there's just simply no ego. The sense of identification has been completely transferred from the separate individual to the infinite. And whereas we can say, I am the bubble, make me the sea, Master is the sea who notices there's a bubble also floating. As Swami put it really well once, he said, Swami Kriyananda is an event for which I am responsible. And I've always loved that phrase because it really puts us in mind of the fact that we are individualized, and we can feel and see that individuality, and it's based to a certain extent on the physical body, but there's also a certain responsibility, a trajectory for the average person like myself. It's a trajectory of unresolved karma that's going to compel me in a certain direction and through certain actions. For a master, and even for Swamiji, it's a divine duty that's been given to them, but nonetheless, it still acts through this individual body. Think of master as being William the Conqueror or Ferdinand III, in which he was the monarch of a country at a time when great war and personal power had to be asserted almost continuously. And yet Master was a fully realized being, and he still lived that because it was a responsibility. It was an event for which he was responsible. In Master's later life, Swami talks about how when they were walking sometime in the garden, at the very, well, Swami only knew Master at the end of his life, but he talked about how sometimes Master would stumble and wouldn't be able to walk properly. And Master's explanation was, I sometimes I forget which body I'm supposed to be moving. He says, I have to ask people whether I've eaten or not. That there was so little relationship. Master was really pulling away. There was so little relationship to his individuality that he literally forgot just sort of ordinary, everyday things. He had to hold his mind to it and needed help to do it. Earlier in his life, when he was really building that work, Master, he died just before he was 60, and he came to America when he was about 26 or 27. But earlier, he just behaved in a much more normal way because he needed to launch the work. He needed people to see him in a certain light. Swami also said something interesting about Master. And Swami said his understanding of Master was always a little different than some of the other long-term disciples. And it occurred to Swami that part of that reason was he came to Master in the last 3.5 years of his life. And some of the others, especially the women, because those are the ones who were the most long-term with Master, came at a much earlier phase when Master was much more like everyone else. That's how Swami put it. In those early years, he wanted to persuade people that they could attain what he had attained, that they could become self-realized just as he was self-realized. And he didn't emphasize the differences. He didn't emphasize the differences in the way he presented himself or even in his teachings, because he needed people to have faith that if Master could do it, they could do it. And it worked. It made it seem like self-realization was accessible to everyone. And then he lived much more in the world. He went on trips, he went camping, he was interested in things and what was going on around him. He liked to travel, he liked to see new places. He was a very active, involved person in the world. By the time Swami saw him, and at first Swami thought it was just a matter of age or of physical health, but he also realized that in Master's life, at the end of his life, it was done. And he just didn't have to hold to that persona anymore, because the event was largely finished. And he was able just to let go of that event. He still had his commentaries to finish, which he did. They weren't published, but he finished writing them. He just did the last few things, then he could let it go. It's very interesting in my experience with Swamiji that he was very much the same way. The way he was when he was younger, when I first met him, when he was in his 40s, he was just very different. That's the only way I can say it. His consciousness was the same, but the way he presented himself to the world was exceedingly different, because he was right at the beginning of the event. And the event was the founding of Ananda, the writing of all these books, the training of all of us, the describing and the establishing of this self-realization way of life. This job he had done for Master in at least 2 other incarnations, when Master was William and Master was Ferdinand III, the job of bringing Master's mission to a practical focus was actually left to his son. his physical son in both of those lifetimes, his spiritual son in this one. But at the end of Swami's life, he just let it all go. He was still exceedingly productive. He wrote the essence of the Bhagavad Gita. He wrote this book. He wrote the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. He wrote movie scripts. He did a great deal of work, but his whole bhav was very, very different. And that was when Narayani came into his life, the last 10 years, and especially for the last half of those 10 years, she took over sort of the event. And Swami was able to be the vibration and the wisdom and the inspiration, but the event, the practical side, and the very Shurjo was there also. They just completely took over the event. And even she practically, I mean, they to almost to a certain extent, they took over his physical body, because his physical body was not really functioning very well. And without her constant care, even just he could hardly walk, moving him from place to place. But as soon as he was settled, Swamiji, the energy was still present. It was just the details of this world. Now that is, that's what we're working for. We're working for this, for complete self-forgetfulness, because the bubble has become the sea. And that's the real transcendence of ego. The transcendence of ego isn't, I'm not important, I'm not important, I'm not important. Who cares about me? Who cares about me? Whereas Swami says, if you do nothing but throw dust on your head, your point of concentration is dust in your own head. Whereas what we want to be is so lost in the contemplation of the divine that the individual separateness just simply does not occur to us. And that's what I was saying about with Swamiji. I often thought he was disciplining himself. For example, when we had an exchange about how much I appreciated that he never made a point of the fact that I was more than 20 years younger than him, and more than 1,000 incarnations, or perhaps 1,000,000, behind him in understanding. But he never, and I mean that literally, it's not hyperbole, he never made reference to that. He never used that as any kind of a reason to not treat me as an equal, even though God knows I wasn't. But when I thanked him for that, when I told him how much I appreciated it, because 30 years later, when I was dealing with people who were more than 20 years younger than me, I sort of saw the dynamic as I hadn't been able to see it when it was I. And I thanked him for that, for his extraordinary respect for me, which he extended to everyone. I don't want you to think that was unique to me, but I experienced it. And his response was, I never noticed. He said, age is a trivial consideration. I mean, the age of the body, that's all it is. A soul can be fully realized and still be a child. It just means nothing. He says, I never think about people's age. He said, I just experience their consciousness and respond accordingly. And that's basically how I saw him. But that was a profound realization that, I discipline myself to have right attitude. For him, this is just how he perceives the world. So Devi Mukherjee says to Master, your humility is inspiring. What humility? There has to be an individual ego for you even to call it humble. This is just simply, Master didn't say it this way, but this is simply who I am, one with the infinite. So there is no necessity to take the individual wave and push it upward. And then, just to finish, because there's that other fantastic phrase in there, I never saw Master affected at all by anything anyone ever said about him. Just let's all sit with that one. Let's really take that one and reflect. What kind of consciousness do you have to be like that? You have to be so relaxed and at ease within yourself, and one's source of security and self-worth and peace of mind, it has to be entirely because I'm loved by God. Because then who cares what anybody says about you? Because if God loves us, if we are at peace with our guru and aware of our unity with the divine, I mean, everybody else is just like little yapping dogs. Like, what difference does it make? Even if it's the most, prestigious, articulate, powerful person in the world, what do they know about us, about me, about you, compared to how God knows our heart and how the Guru is committed to us? Why would we then care? Many of us can learn from what other people say about us. It's interesting how we're perceived. I've had to accept that reality, and many times in my life that, well, and if these people who know me well, somebody doesn't know you at all, it's easier to dismiss. But if somebody who knows you well has a certain opinion about you, well, one has to just ask the question if there's any truth in it. But to be affected by it in the way that Swami means, which is to have it disturb our peace or make us angry or make us feel unworthy, all of that, the source of all of that is that our sense of self is based on too tenuous a ground. Because if it's based on other people recognizing us, appreciating us, well, it's a disappointment that's going to have to be faced. Let's just put it that way. Because that's just the way this world is. And Divine Mother doesn't want us to live dependent upon the ever-changing ways of other people's opinions. She wants us to live only and truly and completely because we know she loves us. And this is, it's well worth, as I was saying, just meditating on this. What is the source of my self-worth and how can I deepen it? And insofar as other people's opinions and their actions toward me can take away my self-confidence or my sense of self-worth. Now, again, just to make sure it's clear, I'm not saying you should never listen. Of course you should listen. You should ask yourself what's true. Swamiji often says that about truth. He says truth is truth, and true words, even spoken in anger, are still true if they are. But our ability to just calmly ask what can I learn from this experience, is quite different than having it crush us or anger us or take away from us our self-confidence. Because all of our confidence is really from pleasing God. And what pleases Him is the sweetness of our hearts. All the rest of it is extra. But once we have that relationship of God's love for us, then actually everything else will follow from that. Once we stand in that, in the light of that freely given gift, everything else is trivial by comparison. That's not a state of mind we can get just by explaining it. But it does tell us in what direction our freedom lies. God bless you.